let's talk about rounding. This has been a hot topic with several teams this week. So the topic of rounding strategies seems like the perfect topic to explore. I'm guessing that most of us have heard and perhaps even taught the rhyme, 5 or more, raise the score. 4 or less, let it rest. But do our students know why it works or what it really means? And why can't it be 4 or more, raise the score? That rhymes too, after all. All right, before we jump into the topic of rounding, we must lay a foundation for our students by spending time ensuring that they understand the idea of midpoint. To support the work we will be doing with rounding next, students will need to understand midpoint. Notice that the third grade students will be asked to round to the nearest 10 or 100. Students in the fourth grade need to understand how to round any whole number to any place. And fifth graders will extend their rounding to decimal values. All right, so let's take a quick look at some midpoint. So, midpoint. Let's think of it in terms of a number line. If I have a number line that is 0 to 10, what would be halfway? 5. So 5 is the midpoint when I have a space of 10. But what if we extend this to 100? Now we have a distance of 100. What would the midpoint be? The midpoint would now be 50, since that 100 would be equally broken into 2 halves of 50. Same thing happens if I go to 1,000. My span is now 1,000. So half of that would be 500. So my midpoint sits at 500. What if I go ahead and go to 10,000? I had 10 thousands, so half of that would be 5 thousands. Are you noticing a pattern here? All right, so let's talk a little bit about rounding. Let's start with a typical number for grade 3. Let's say in third grade, students are given the number 437, and they're asked to round it to the nearest hundredths place. So the first thing we would ask them to do is identify what digit is in the hundredths place. 4. So do we agree that we have 4 hundreds? Well, what if I gave you one more 100? What if I had enough to make the next 100? Instead of having 4 hundredths, we would have 5 hundredths. So I could create a number line that looks like this. The span of this number line is 100 because we're rounding to the hundreds. So the span will be 100, which means half of that is 50, and 450 more is 450. So I now know that when I round 437, there's only 2 possibilities that it could be of all the numbers in the world. It's either going to be 400 or it's going to be 500. I'm using my midpoint because mathematicians made a rule that said if you have at least half, if you can get to at least the midpoint, we would round to the greater value. So let's take a look. I have 4 hundredths and 37 ones. The midpoint is 4 hundredths and 50 ones. I don't have enough. This number would fall on this side of the number line, meaning I would round to the 400. Let's try it again, but let's use the same number. And let's imagine that we've asked students to round this to the nearest tens. What digit is in the tens place? The 3. So, how many tens do I have? Be careful here. I didn't ask which digit is in the tens. I'm asking if I have the number 437, how many tens do I have? I have 43 tens and 7 ones. Do you see how that works? So if I have 43 tens, what would the next amount of tens be? 44 tens. 43 tens is 430. 44 tens is 440. I know that if I round the number 437 to the nearest tens, it must be one of these two numbers. And that's it. Those are the only two choices. So let me find the midpoint. So since I'm working with tens, I know the gap was 10. If I split it evenly, it would be 5 on each side. So 430 and 5 more would be 435. And now I know I'm rounding to the tens. I have 43 tens and 7 ones. The midpoint is 43 tens and 5 ones. I have at least half. So this number falls on this side of the number line, which means I round it to 440, since 437 would be closer to 440 than it is to 430. All right, let's bump this up. This is still third grade. I'm going to move my original value to a thousands place. The standard for rounding in third grade is round to the nearest 10 or 100. So let's say we want to round this to the nearest 100. First, we identify what digit is in the hundredths place, and I have a 3 in the digits place. So I ask, how many hundredths do I have? I have 43 hundredths. If I have enough to make one more hundred, I would have 44 hundredths. 43 hundredths simply looks like this, and 44 hundredths looks like that. Because we're rounding to the hundredths place, I know that the distance needs to be 100. Half that distance would be 50. So 4,300 plus 50 more would be 4,350. So I have 43 hundredths and 50 ones. In the original, I have 43 hundredths and 76 ones. I have more ones than I need, so it will be greater than the midpoint, and I know that it will round to 4,400. This was all work that falls within the third grade realm of understanding, which means that fourth graders and fifth graders would also need to know this. So in addition to knowing this third grade work, we would want our fourth graders to extend their knowledge to include even larger place values. So let's use the value of 144,309. I can ask students to round this to any place value in grade 4. Grade 4 requirements is simply that it's a whole number value rounded to any whole number place value. So let's go ahead and round this to the thousands place. First, I'm going to identify my thousands place and then identify how many thousands I have. I have 144 thousands. If I had enough to make one more thousand, I would have 145 thousands. Written in standard form, it looks like this. I know that when I round this number, 144,309, it is either going to be 144,000 or 145,000 if I'm rounding to the thousands place value. Remember, we're rounding to the thousands place value. That means that this distance is 1,000. What would the midpoint of that be? 500 on each side. So 144,500 more would just simply be 144,500. So I have 144,000s and 500 ones at the midpoint. My original number is 144,309 ones. I don't have enough ones to get to the midpoint, so my number will fall on this side of the midpoint, meaning that I round to the lesser value. Nothing changed. It's exactly like the third grade work that we were doing. We're just using larger numbers now. All right, fifth grade gets a little bit more complex, but we're going to continue using the same ideas we've been using. In grade 5, they work with decimal values. So what I want to take a look at first is let's take a look at where that might occur. Let's say that we have 450 divided by 7. And we get this decimal value. 35 decimal point 7142857143, and it actually continues on and on. We need to represent this in a way, and we'll use rounding to give an approximate. So we have all of these values. Let's go ahead and write some of those down. So I started with 250, I divided it by 7, and I ended up with approximately these digits. And it's going to go on and on and on and on and on. Okay? So let's use this number and round it. So let's begin by rounding it to just simply the whole number, which would be the ones place. So we're going to round here to the ones place. I have 35 ones. If I have one more one, I would just have 36 ones. That easy. The midpoint between 35 and 36 is simply 35 and a half, or 35 and 5/10. And I'm going to take a look at my original number. My original number is 35 and 7/10. I only need 5/10 to get to the midpoint. I have 7/10, so I have enough to be greater than midpoint, which means in this case it would round to the number 36 if we're rounding it to a whole number. All right, so let's take our value again. On and on and on and on. And this time, let's say we're going to round it to the 10ths place. First thing I'll do is I'll see how many tenths do I already have. And what if I had one more tenth? Well, if I had one more tenth, instead of 7/10, I would have 8/10. So I would have 35 and 7/10 and 35 and 8/10. I know that when I round this number to the 10ths place, the estimated answer is going to be either 35 and 7/10 or 35 and 8/10. And that's it. Those are my only choices. Of all the numbers in the universe, it has to be one of these two. Now, when working with decimals, it will be easier for us to find the midpoint if we use an equivalent value by placing and calling it 70 hundredths and 80 hundredths. Because between the 70 hundredths and the 80 hundredths, it's much easier to recognize that the midpoint would be 75 hundredths. So now when I look at my decimal, I'm going to look and see what number do I have to the hundredths. And I notice I have 35 and 71 hundredths. I need 35 and 75 hundredths to get to the midpoint. I don't have enough to get to the midpoint. So I will be on this side of the midpoint, meaning I would round to the lesser value. All right, you want to try again? Let's do the same number. But this time, let's round it not to the tenths place, but let's round it to the tens place. So think about that. How many tens do I have? I have 3 tens. What if I had one more 10? Then I'd have 4 tens. Easy enough. 3 tens is 30. 4 tens is 40. I know when I round this number, that, remember, went on and on and on, the rounded value to the tens place is either going to be 30 or 40, and that's it. The midpoint between 30 and 40 is 35. I have 35. So it seems it's going to fall right on the midpoint. Well, mathematicians made a rule that said if it falls on the midpoint, if you get to at least halfway, you round to the greater value. So I would be rounding up to 40. And in this case, I even have additional parts to support that I really do have a little bit more than 35. So I should be rounding to the greater value of 40. All right, last one. Let's take the same number. Let's keep working with it. On and on and on and on. This time, let's round to the hundredths place. What digit is in the hundredths place? Tenths, hundredths. So how many hundredths do we know we have for sure? 35 and 71 hundredths. If we had just one more hundredth, we would have 35 and 72 hundredths. I know that when I round this number to the hundredths place, either this value or this value must be the answer. It depends on whether or not I can get to the midpoint or not. Now remember, with decimals, it's often easier if we do an equivalent value and call this 710 thousandths, 720 thousandths, if we just increase it so it's easier to see the midpoint. Because when I look at this 10 and this 20, I know the midpoint of 10 and 20 is 15. So the midpoint of this number must be 35, 715 thousandths. So now I'm going to take a look at this number to the thousandths place, and I notice I have 35 and 714 thousandths. Almost, but not quite. It's going to fall just short, which means I have a little bit less than midpoint, so I round it to the value that is less. By focusing our thinking about place value to which value we are rounding, and then determining how many we have of that place value, and then thinking about what if we had one more, we can simplify the process and the language, since we're not mixing all of the place value names together in a single conversation. Try it with your students. See if your students find this to be both a simpler process and if they find it to be easier conceptually to understand, both the how and the why that we round numbers the way that we do.